Welcome, everyone. My name is Zitzi Miraker. I am a member of the League of Lexington Voters, the League of Women Voters of Lexington. It's been a long day. And I'm so excited and delighted to welcome you all to this community forum, which is titled Traces and Fragments, Piecing Together the Story of People Enslaved at Ashland. We're really lucky tonight to have three presenters from Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate. I'll introduce them in just a moment here, but I wanted to note that this is part of the League's ongoing commemoration of Black History Month. In terms of logistical information before we get started, looks like almost everyone is muted, but please take a moment to make sure you're muted, unless you're speaking. Please do ask questions. On that note, you're welcome to add questions to the chat and unmute yourself and ask questions of our speakers. We'll have some time for Q&A with all three of our speakers at the end. And please note that we're recording this event, so we'll be available to those who aren't able to join us here this evening. Okay, so without further ado, let me please introduce you to our three speakers for this evening. Our first speaker today will be Paul Bartels, who is the Tours and Education Manager at Ashland. Paul earned his BA in History from the University of Portland and an MA concentrated in Early American History from Villanova University. He taught social studies, grades 7 through 12 in rural Oregon before training teachers and teaching a variety of education courses at the University of Iowa and Cornell College. In addition to his work at Ashland, Paul serves on the executive committee of the Kentucky Civic Education Coalition. Thanks so much for being here, Paul, and welcome. I'm going to introduce Jim or James Clark next, although he will be our third speaker, just so I don't cause confusion. Jim is the executive director at Ashland, and Jim graduated with a master's degree in public policy from New York University and a BS in urban studies from the University of Southern California. He has more than 30 years experience in nonprofit management, having been the executive director of the Public Art Fund in New York City, the president and CEO of CultureWorks in Dayton, Ohio, and at LexArts here in Lexington. In 2014, he was honored with the Michael Newton Award from the Americans for the Arts for innovation in forging arts and business partnerships, and Outstanding Individual of the Year from the Downtown Lexington Corporation. Under his leadership, the foundation received the Thomas D. Clark Award for Excellence in 2020 from the Kentucky Historical Society. Jim serves on the board of directors of the Kentucky Museum and Heritage Alliance and was appointed by LFUCG Mayor Jim Gray to the Public Art Commission. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for being here as well.
Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. M.J. Stottman, who is the Assistant Director of the Kentucky Archaeological Survey. Jay earned his BA in Anthropology from the University of Louisville and his MA and PhD from the University of Kentucky, with a focus in historical archaeology. He has spent more than 27 years with the Kentucky Archaeological Survey and now serves as assistant director, working at a variety of sites across the state. Kentucky has a passion for public archaeology, Jay has a passion for public archaeology, making his research accessible to wide and diverse audiences. Welcome, Jay, and sorry about my reading tonight. So without further ado, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Paul.
Hi. Thank you so much for having us this evening. It's an honor to be able to present to this wonderful group. As somebody who's spent a lot of my adult life around the topic of civic education, this is in many ways a group of fellow travelers. So thank you for having me. Along those lines, though I'm trained as a historian initially, I kind of enter the world from the perspective of a teacher. And, Zitzi and I were talking a little bit before we got started and found out that we have a common, background in social foundations of education. We both, taught that course at the university level. And one of the things I kind of wanted to start with, particularly with this audience, is that much of the way I look at the work that we do at Ashland is through the lens of feminist care ethics. And I've been really influenced by the work of Carol Gilligan, who was the genesis of that paradigm, but more particularly from an educational standpoint, the work of educational philosopher Nell Noddings. And so that leads directly into the first part of what we're trying to do at Ashland right now, and that's community engagement. And care ethics is about relationality and thinking about the world as a web of relationships. And while it's easy to think of historical work as dusty archives and solitary work, history is ultimately an intensely social discipline. All academic work, all knowledge creation is social in nature. And it's important, particularly when you're dealing with difficult histories, like we are with the history of the enslaved people at Ashland, to remember this is about people, that this is an intensely human and intersubjective kind of work. And so I just kind of wanted to start with that a little bit, because that really informs, I think, the way that I think through the notion of community engagement. Ultimately, we serve a public, and we want to serve as wide a public as possible, and to have that public be able to see themselves in our site, and to see their stories as recognized, to see themselves as recognized. And the difficult thing with that, with groups of individuals and groups of people that don't leave behind a written record, is that work is very difficult to do. Now, we all know that the reason why enslaved people in large did not leave that written record is that the tools of literacy were denied to them. And this was purposeful. Not only were they denied that in their own lives, but their memory is adumbrated because of that denial. And so a lot of our work is trying to undo those attempts at erasure in the historical record, to be creative, to find different techniques to get at their voices, reconstruct their lives, and allow them to be understood on their own terms as much as possible. So that work can't be done alone by people like myself at a historical site. That requires outreach to the larger community and building relationships and trust with that community. And one of the key things is being a good listener and being willing to listen to groups that have experienced degrees of trauma, pain, and suffering around the history that needs to be told. One of the things that I think of on a daily basis, I sit in what was a service element or service area of the house. So this would have been very much black space in the house. There's a certain kind of weight of responsibility that sort of seeps into my bones on a daily basis because of the experiences of the people who were forced to work in that physical space. And so one of the things is that I have to take that responsibility and turn that as much as I can into action and into positive steps toward building something that is a shared social project with the larger community. And like I said, listening is a huge part of that. And what that also connotes is that though there aren't written records, there's a rich oral history in the community, in any community. And that is something that we need to honor and that we need to try to understand and that we need to allow them to tell at Ashland. And so one of our largest initiatives is to try to build relationships so that those oral histories can become a part of the stories that we tell around enslavement and the lives of those enslaved at Ashland. Just yesterday afternoon, I was at a lecture at UK given by a wonderful woman, Sharon Mitchell, who's the founder of the African American Genealogical Group of Kentucky. And she's a perfect example of the type of individual that we need to listen to at Ashland. I mean, she's spent much of the last 4 or 5 decades rifling through county records, marriage records, trying to rebuild family trees that were erased by slavery, by enslavement in this time period. And that's really difficult work. And so one of the things we are trying to do is tap into those networks and to allow a platform for those networks to put their knowledge out into the world for the larger public writ large. Another thing in terms of community engagement that we're working on is creating opportunities for special programming. For example, this year, and it's tied to something that Jay will talk about later in terms of the archaeology, is that we're attempting to bring the slave dwelling project to Ashland. And the founder and lead public historian who's at Magnolia Plantation in South Carolina, Joe McGill, has presented first-person interpretation of enslavement at, I think, in 19 states, and I think, gosh, Jay, how many sites has Joe been to?
I'm not sure, but he's always out of town every weekend from his normal job.
So, I mean, Joe does interpretation. He works with an entire group of individuals who interpret enslavement, ranging from things like woodworking to brick making to ironworks, laundress work, storytelling. I mean, it really foodways. It runs a gamut, and we're trying to bring as wide a representation of those experiences as possible, and make that a free event for the public to have that available, so that those voices are elevated and that people from the African American community can express their interpretation of this experience in this time period. Probably taking a little bit too much time here, so I'll try to be quick. We have as an educator, we have a lot of educational initiatives that dovetail into that community outreach. I don't see the line there, but some people do. Regardless, I've done a fair amount of work doing outreach to diverse schools here in Lexington. Winburn will be here tomorrow. Winburn Middle School will be here tomorrow for the third time this year, a third group of students. The Learning Center will be here when we're doing garden archaeology, which is an alternative school on the north side. And Jay and his associate Lori Stahlgren, who have a lot of experience in public archaeology, will be giving an archaeological dimension to their visit next Wednesday. And so they'll have like a hands-on experience, and that will be really neat. And in that educational programming, we want, especially young African American students, to be able to see themselves in the stories that are told at Ashland, rather than just talking about Henry Clay. And so we do a balanced sort of programming that, there's discussion of Clay, and Clay can't be disentangled from a larger discussion of enslavement in this time period because of his politics and the compromises that he was an architect of, but also the fact that he was personally an enslaver, and Ashland and his own personal wealth were built on enslavement. And you can focus on that aspect, but we really like to also bring the dimensions of agency that enslaved people had. And the themes that we emphasize are resilience and resistance. And we tell specific stories that we've been able to piece together around those themes. And the students' responses have been really positive and interesting in that respect. Two other things that we're doing, I'll turn over to my colleagues. One is that we're continuing archaeological work at Ashland. Our next archaeological day will be next Wednesday, and so Dr. Jay Stottman will go into some detail about that. And the last thing is that Jim Clark will be talking about, if you haven't seen on the news already, memorialization for the enslaved at Ashland, and the public art project that we will be talking through with the community in that respect. And Jim is the best qualified person to talk on that matter. So I'll stop torturing you and turn you over to Jay.
All right, thanks, Paul. I'm gonna share screen here. All right, so as Paul said, I have a lot of experience in public archaeology, and actually quite a bit of experience working on plantations like Ashland. In fact, I started working at Ashland back in 2000 when my mentor, Dr. Kim McBride, was running the project, and so it was one of the sites that I worked on when I was in graduate school. And I'm happy to pick up where Kim left off now that she's retired. And so we're looking to get back to Ashland and do some more work. Another thing about what I do with public archaeology is that we think of, is I like to think of archaeology as not just being about the past. It is about the present. And archaeology is a way that we can connect the past to the present. And what I mean by that is we can use the process of learning about the past to engage people in the present. So archaeology is one of those ways that you can learn about history that is very tactile, very tangible, and it's a way that people can actually get their hands on pieces of history. And so we like to get them involved in that process because it helps provide the people who are participating in programs like this an avenue for getting some ownership of the process, some ownership of the information that that we're learning about. And so I have invariably worked on a lot of sites that involve learning about the history of African Americans. And that wasn't by choice. It just happened that way because there weren't a lot of archaeologists around to do that work. And I just kind of fell into it a lot of times because, first of all, I don't think I am the best person to do African American archaeology and to tell people about African Americans. For obviously, if you see the video, you know I'm a white guy. And so there's a perspective on this past that I will never have. There's a perspective that I cannot have. So everything is put through my filter when I talk about these things. But as an archaeologist, I can work on these sites, I can provide information, and I can engage people in this process. And that's what I tried to do. So when we work at plantation sites, we can use archaeology as a way to, I guess, as a way to learn about the people that Paul is talking about, to humanize people who, in the past and in documents, are often reduced to numbers or property, things like that. And what we do is the people who don't have things written about them or a lot of history that's written down about them, it's easy to erase those kinds of things, but you can't hide from your garbage. And that's what archaeologists do. We find the things that people had, the things that people used every day, the things that people threw away or lost. These things get buried, but an archaeologist is going to come and dig them up. And we can use those things of everyday life to learn about people in everyday life. And so archaeologists have contributed greatly to our understanding of enslaved people's experiences and actually shed some light on thinking about enslaved people in a different way. Working at so many of these sites in a public way has taught me a little something about what people want to see. I've had numerous African-American visitors to our sites want to know not about how bad it was, because they see it. The bad things about slavery is indicating that their ancestors were just victims all the time, that they had no way to resist or do anything about it. And they don't like to think of their ancestors in that way. And so what we can do in archaeology is we have actually found ways or information that shows that people weren't always just passive victims who could do nothing about their condition, that they were actively doing things to resist, create community, to make themselves human in the eyes of other people. So we can do that with some of the artifacts that we find. So what I want to do now is just tell you a little bit about our efforts to locate the slave houses at Ashland. Hopefully it'll work. There we go. So there we go. Yeah. So when I came to Ashland in 2000, we were there to do an archaeological survey of the whole property. And so what that means is we're going to come there, we're going to dig little holes all over the place and see what's there. What kind of archaeological materials are there? What are the deposits like? Have they been disturbed very much? Just what kind of archaeological potential does Ashland have as an archaeological site? And so that means doing something like you see on the screen now, which is digging those little holes all over the entire property and getting a sample of what used to be there. So what you see here is a map of all the holes that we dug. And I don't remember how many, but I think it was around 800 to 900 holes all over this, all over the property, so that we could find out where some of these archaeological materials are. I mean, you see a lot of our holes were very concentrated around the buildings, where we thought buildings might be. Those are places where we will find a lot of artifacts, because that's where most of the human activity took place. Now, this map shows you where most of those artifacts that we found were. So these show concentrations of artifacts, and of course, they are located right around the buildings and things. What you don't see is you don't see a whole lot of artifacts by the garden. So the garden is that big rectangle there. That was sort of a blank spot that we weren't allowed to really investigate that for obvious reasons, because what gardener wants archaeologists to come up and dig up their garden, right? So obviously we could not do any digging in there at that time. And so we don't have any data there. So we call that a data gap. But here you can see there are lots of artifacts around the house, around the smokehouse, around the cottage, and that where it says E and F, that's where some barns were, some other buildings were. That doesn't really help us very much in locating the slave houses. And that's one thing from the survey that we were a little disappointed about. We didn't find these concentrations of artifacts from buildings and things like that where there might have been slave houses. Now we do have an idea where they might be. You know, this is a map that from a recollection of somebody, and I don't remember who it is. I think this is that book about the cat, I think. But it indicates that the slave houses were in the middle. So you see a row of little squares there by the letter E, and that happens to be right about where the garden is. So our other sources of information sort of point to that area as being a place where enslaved people would have lived. Unfortunately, we have a data gap there. Now, we were able to concentrate some of our efforts there. There were artifacts over there near the edge of the garden, and so we put some more holes, bigger holes. So if you think about the holes that we dig, where they're like sort of windows into the archaeology, and the bigger you make the window, the more you see. And so we did put in some more excavation, what we call units, in that area to see, can we find any evidence of the slave houses that are shown on that map, and perhaps find some more artifacts. And in 2004, I believe we did some excavations right at the edge of the garden. I think that was about as close as we could get to the garden. I think it was we could get about as close as 10 meters to the garden without killing the boxwoods. And so part of our efforts were not only research focused, but also had public education components to it. So Kim McBride ran a program, a field trip for school kids that can come and dig with us. This is modeled after a program that I do in Louisville, where we have about 5,000 kids a year come out and visit our archaeological sites and participate in the dig with us. So we modeled another program like that for Ashland, and for about 2 years, I think 2 or 3 years, we had school groups consistently coming out to Ashland and participating in the excavation of the where we thought the slave houses might be. And so here you see a picture of some of that program with the kids getting involved in that. And again, this is just a really great way to, get your hands dirty, do something, and actually learn something about history too at the same time. And the kids really love doing it, and they actually learn quite a bit. So what did we find? So we did find evidence of houses or buildings there. So what you're looking at here, of course, there's a big pile of brick over there in the picture, but you see this layer that has all this brick and mortar and plaster in it. And what that tells us is that, of course, buildings were demolished in that area. And we're seeing parts of some of the building remains that have been spread out after the buildings were demolished. And that shows up as a layer of brick and plaster and things like that. We also found some post holes, and post holes are usually a good indication of structures as well. So we probably had post holes associated with like the porch of a building, or perhaps a smaller outbuilding or something like that. So we're on the right track here with the things that we were finding. Also, some little trash pits or ash pits. So there's definitely human activity going on here, probably places where people are living. But this is about it. We did not find a lot. We did not, we found artifacts. I think I got a picture of some, yeah. We found some artifacts, and they're very typical of places where people live. This is just a little sampling of it, but certainly with buildings, we found lots of nails and window glass, and brick and things like that. But we also get personal items like bits of clothing, like buttons and marble, some of the some pieces of dishes and crockery, and this really interesting shell game piece, I think is the best we could come up with for what that thing is, a shell game piece. And so we're finding things that you would expect of the time period during slavery, and associated with places where people lived. So we know it's around there somewhere. We just weren't, we feel like we were just on the edge of it. And of course, we were just on the edge of it. We were on the edge of the garden. But more recently, I approached the garden club and asked if we might be able to get into the garden and do some testing. Now, certainly we're not going to open up these big excavation units like we were just doing, but if we could just go in there and dig a few small holes and just see if there are some archaeological remains in there of these buildings, that would be great, because before we've had no idea, because we've not been able to do anything. And so lucky for us, the garden is undergoing a lot of change right now, not only in its leadership, but also they're doing a lot of renovations. So they're rebuilding pathways, they're redoing a lot of parts of the garden, which means the garden's tore up. And this was a great opportunity for us to get in there. Hey, we can just go in there and dig some holes while it's already tore up, and you don't have to worry about us tearing it up. And so they agreed to that, and we did a small little survey, just of one little part, just as a test, so as to make the garden folks feel comfortable about with what I was doing, because they didn't really understand. So I went out, dug a few holes in a disturbed area that they were working on, and showed them that this is all we're doing. And sure enough, found some artifacts that are probably related to where a structure might have been. So we got nails and window glass and some pieces of dishes and things like that. So we're finding that evidence that we were looking for. Now, the part of the garden I was working in, it also happened to be close to the cottage too. So we're still not sure if these are artifacts from the cottage or artifacts from the slave houses. So we're going to come back and do more work in the garden on Wednesday, and we will be able to have much more access to the garden there. And we're going to get have some volunteers coming in. We'll be talking with the school kids about doing archaeology there, and get some of the garden club members also will be joining us, and seeing if we can fill that data gap that we've been missing for 23 years now. All right, so I'll be available for questions if anybody has any, and I'll turn it over to Jim. But if anybody's interested about archaeology, you can learn more about Kentucky archaeology by visiting our website. And if you find Kentucky archaeology on Facebook, we're always posting new information about archaeology in Kentucky.
Great, thanks, Jay. At this point, we have developed a new tour, which started back in 2020, called Traces, Slavery at Ashland. And we've gained more information as we've unearthed more information about the enslaved at Ashland, and learning about the lives of these people. And the next step is that we are about to unveil an exhibit called Traces and Fragments that makes visible the process that we're trying to piece together the stories of these people. And that's the one thing that we want to focus on, is the individuals and their family histories and their connections to one another and to the larger community. And to that end, we're hoping that the fragments and traces of information that we have can reach, as Paul was saying, out into the community, because this project should be a bridge between whatever artifactual information we have that can be tied to family histories, stories, folklore, whatever. I mean, whatever these descendant communities might have, because we know that there's generations of African Americans in the Lexington area who settled in the free Black communities surrounding Lexington after emancipation. So there is a rich history there, and we want to make that connection between whatever information we have to what they have. And to that end, we want to create a memorial on the site, just as Henry Clay's descendants have used the mansion, the outbuildings, and the property as a way to create a living memorial for Henry. We need to create a touchstone somewhere on the property that becomes that connection to people who were enslaved at Ashland. So we have a call out now to a national call for artists or artist teams to submit ideas. That process, the call ends at the end of this month. And from that, we will select 3 artists or an artist team to create a fully developed proposal. So we're providing $2,500 stipend for that process. And we are looking forward to having a memorial of some sort created by June 2025, which would be the 250th anniversary of the founding of Lexington. And also in 2026, which is the 250th anniversary of our nation, but it's also the 100th anniversary of the Henry Clay Memorial Foundation. So it seems that this time would be to use these commemorative moments as a way to talk about where we've come as an organization and to provide a holistic view of this history. And I'm not a historian. I come out of working with nonprofits, but also out of government, of working in municipalities. And I was intrigued by the fact that when I got to Ashland this April, it will be 8 years, that we weren't really confronting this idea that Henry Clay's personal and political life was totally entwined with slavery, that they're inseparable, that he was confronted with this on a daily basis. And I think it's not that we're just awakening to this idea of looking at this history of enslavement, but it's also a way, it's the complexity of history, and it's the messiness of history that makes it interesting. And that's what makes it also relevant at this time. I mean, when we're looking at contemporary issues that deal with these combative states' rights issues versus the federal government, voting laws of who counts in our society. I mean, Henry Clay's time in history is, I think, more relevant than it's ever been in terms of how do you keep moving forward in a progressive way to create a more perfect union. And that's what I'm hoping that through this process of memorializing the people who were enslaved there makes our story all the more robust and relevant to especially the next generation of leaders. So thank you for allowing us to present this evening.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Paul, Jay, and Jim. This has been really interesting, as is evidenced by a lot of questions that are coming up in the chat. So I'm going to try and do my best to make our way through some of them. And Jay, I see you've started to already respond to some in the chat as well. So let me ask a few quick questions. So Jay, you had mentioned the public dig coming up this Wednesday, and so that would be Wednesday, February
22nd.
22nd. And it sounds like that is open to the public. Would people need to register in advance if they were interested in joining that?
Yeah, not really. The kind of digging we're doing is not real conducive to people actually participating with us in that, but you will be able to at least see it and, you know, talk with us, at least when I'm not talking to the kids, and that kind of thing. So you can see that process in action. But hopefully in the future, there'll be opportunities to talk more about, or at least have more opportunities for people to that are more conducive to getting people involved. Yeah.
And Tsitsi, I wanted to respond to Marilyn's question about local people identified. Not local, but we have someone in New York and another person in Louisiana that have traced their family ties to Ashland. And with those two women we've been working with for quite a while. Eric has done a lot of genealogical work with them. But that is one of our goals through our community advisors who helped us in creating the Traces tour that we started with a listening session at the Lyric back in 2018. And from that, we created a group of community advisors that helped us refine the Traces tour. And that was a very rewarding process. I mean, we went through probably 9 iterations of that tour, of refining the language, the stories that were told, and the tone of the tour. And that helped us tremendously. So we're looking to re-engage the people that worked with us before, as well as expand that network. And actually, I will know that we've had a successful project in terms of the memorial if there's lasting connections between people in the community to Ashland, that there's ties that have been created, because this is not about just creating some marker that sits there with names, and it's more about creating an atmosphere and a sense of connection to that place. And that, I mean, ultimately, that's what I want. I know that because I was the director of the Public Art Fund in New York City, I know that artists can surprise us with how to interpret especially difficult histories. And I think that there's what ultimately I would want is to create a space that has it's more about the feeling than the physical object. And also with new technologies, I'm not sure what we might end up with, but I'm anxious to see how artists will respond to this call.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. A couple of people in the chat had asked about the extent to which some of Ashland's, so sort of buildings that used to be Henry Clay's, could they be under homes in the area?
Definitely.
So it's certainly possible. The difficulty is that we don't have as good of maps, like we don't get the sort of bird's eye view maps that you would, get through like Google Earth or something like that. They don't always like fall in our lap, in an archive. But we do have some maps that we can work with. One of the more interesting ones, points to the potentiality that there were quarters of enslaved people roughly where like the cross street of Lakewood and Romney roads would be. I mean, we have to remember this was originally a 660 acre, property plantation. Ashland currently only sits on 17 acres. And the other aspect here is that likely because Henry Clay first began his own like built environment at Ashland early in the 19th century, and that process continued with his son James all the way up into 1858. And then there were even subsequent buildings beyond that. We can't think about a one-time building project that remains static in time. There were, to use an archaeological term, there were probably complexes, of buildings over time. And so even like the question of where the quarters of the enslaved were located, that's a movable question. It's likely, for example, based on the larger history of the built environment for the enslaved in the bluegrass region, that early on those structures were wooden and were probably destroyed. And the few oblique references we get in the written record to the quarters of the enslaved are that these were brick buildings, whitewashed, etc. And those started appearing mostly in the 1840s, at which point Henry Clay's personal fortune is well established. And, enslavers want to project a certain imagery of their power, of their wealth to their visitors. And one way in which they do that is through not only the house proper, but through all the outbuildings, including quarters for the enslaved people. And so when we ask things like where were the quarters of the enslaved, it's not a static kind of thing. And so we have to be open-minded to new evidence. And I mean, the crazy thing about history is we're literally like making history all the time. It's a discipline that is changing consistently.
Yeah.
And so we
Paul,
find
sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to flag, Jill just asked actually a really relevant question to what you're saying. So I wanted to just put it in here. Jill asked, to what extent is this contemporary story at Ashland being chronicled?
Jim, do you want to take that one?
We were just talking about that today, that that the conversations that we're having needs to be documented and have roundtable discussions, because even within our organization, there's the different approaches and different points of view of how we look at things. And I forget, it was several months ago, we had a discussion at the John Hunt Morgan House with the University of Kentucky and Public History Department about the architecture of slavery. And afterwards, I just hit myself on the head because we didn't document it. And it out of that, you know, there was this information about, as Paul was referencing, that, you know, in terms of there's the architecture of slavery has its vernaculars, depending on where you are from South Carolina, Virginia, up into Kentucky. And that, but John Nicholson, who's our program and research associate, who has a degree in material culture, had looked up that in the bluegrass area, there was a tradition of, especially houses like Ashland, that the slave quarters for the enslaved people who worked in the house would be of a higher quality, would mimic or could actually mimic the actual architecture of the main house, or be more simplified, but certainly, as Paul said, it would demonstrate the wealth of the enslavers. But for the field hands, that story would probably be very different. And we know that up where Christ the King is where the thoroughbred training area and track was. So more than likely, that is where the slave quarters that Paul's referencing at Lakewood and Romney Road would have been, in that area. But all of that has been lost to the subdivision of the property, except I've heard many stories of people saying that they've got posts in their yard that probably were from the training track. And there's probably other evidence of things in people's yards, but that area has been so disturbed over the years that it'd probably be hard pressed to, and I doubt if anybody really wants us digging around in their backyard to find slave quarters. You know, and we also know that a lot of people who own farms in the area that were plantations are very reluctant to provide access to buildings that they know were slave quarters, that they would rather not talk about that. And, you know, and they've used them for different purposes. And we know in one case that somebody's using it as a guest house. Obviously, it's been altered, but you know, even to this day, people find it difficult to talk about those structures being on their property.
Yeah, it speaks to Paul's point at the beginning about the importance of the relational and conversational aspects of the work you're doing. We have time for one last question, and I wanted to raise Sharon's question from the chat. So Sharon asks, what has been learned that was not already known about the experience of people enslaved at Ashland? And given what has been discovered, is it premature to ask that question?
It's a little premature to ask that question because we're just skirting on the outside of where the information we would need would be. So we do have some information, but really not enough to really say a whole lot about that. We can barely confirm that these slave houses are actually at that location. Now, will we eventually be able to do that? More than likely. At other places I've worked, we have found a great deal of information that has told us about the kinds of things enslaved people had access to, their interactions with other people, other enslaved individuals from other plantations, and their interactions with the bigger economy and people in the city. So we're learning a lot of things from these other sites that I work on, and I have no doubt that we could learn more about the enslaved people at Ashland in the same kind of way. And I wanted to say something about one of the questions about corroborating evidence with the archaeological evidence with historical evidence. And I think it's a very important point to think about this. It's important to think about these ways of learning about history all contributing to the same goal. And what it does, it's not, these sources of information are not competing with each other, but they're complementary. So what happens oftentimes, it's sort of a pendulum effect where you're asking questions of certain sources of data and it's bouncing off these different things. So you may not know to ask a question of the documents until you have found something in the archaeology, and but you would never have thought of that question before. And vice versa with the historical documents, you may never, with archaeology, we may have not ever decided to dig in a certain place without those documents. So everything is very complementary, and it's all building towards a richer interpretation of the past. We're never going to know exactly what happened in the past, but we can get pretty darn close if we're using all the information available to us.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I'll say in relation to that is, I mean, Jay's just reemphasizing the importance of this being a social process. You know, we work together. We care deeply about this work, and we share our evidence. We talk with one another. We cross-check each other because the stakes are high with the things that we put out into the world. And so, yeah, I mean, Jay makes a number of really important points there about the interrelationality of our disciplines.
And also, I just wanted to add, in terms of discussing the experience of the enslaved, that one of the things we want to be very careful about is speculating on anybody's experience. That we can't fathom what it would like to be an owned object, and to be not regarded as a human, but as a tool. And we want to be very careful in how we present that information, that we are not ever trying to put ourselves in their shoes. That's impossible. And that's one of the challenges that we face in telling this story of trying to present objects, artifacts, documents that help build an idea of what life was like, but we will never be able to fathom what they experienced. So thank you for the opportunity to.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for the work you're doing and for making the time to share it with us. We're really, really grateful. Thank you, Paul, Jim, and Jay. I just wanted to say that our next event will be a book club meeting where we will be following up on this conversation that we started today by reading and discussing Henry Clay, The Man Who Would Be President by James C. Clotter. I will say that it's okay to come to book club if you haven't read the book. Please join us for conversation and to make some friends and continue the discussion. Mo, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I think we've got a lot that we could also question after we read the book about, of what Henry Clay contributed to the United States. But also, in our view of history right now, it's really hard to look at somebody that owned slaves and feel good about them. So how do we look at history? How do we look at our former leaders, which so many of them did own slaves? How do we look at where we are today? And it's all connected.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we need to ask those questions. Is he still relevant? Is he still this wonderful person? Because he did a lot of wonderful things for our country. But we're all human, and we all have feet of clay. Oh, but for Henry Clay, it's a last name too. But but in that time period, white men especially, were so entitled and women and everyone else, anyone else in society was below that, and very wealthy white men were the most entitled.
Actually, Maureen, thank you. That's the fine line we're walking. People who come to Ashland, visitors, want to learn about Henry Clay, and that what we have to do is weave this complex story together because the adage of good people have done bad things and bad people have done good things, and anyone who can't understand the complexity of a political leader in that time period would have a hard time understanding American history, period.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well,
But I'm glad that you're doing this. It's very exciting. I'm a former history teacher, and I have so many students that would love to see where their ancestors might have been.
Yeah.
a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much. I have my email up on the screen if you have ideas for future virtual or in-person events. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Take care.
Thank you.